Good. So, dear colleagues and friends, dear participants, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. We have participants connected from all over the world, including our distinguished panelists for this session. This is a session 2.1 for the participants who are connecting to this parallel session. And this is a session that is going to address how to address the social and emotional dimension of learning when it comes to assessments. So we will hear interesting reflection and experiences on the need for considering how to assess social emotional learning across different scales, of course, from learner to the whole system, across power imbalances when it comes to issue of equity, across diversity when it comes to learners' needs, cultural diversity, gender norms, and etc. We know that listening to the plenary earlier this morning on overall monitoring when it comes to this target 4.7 and also assessing the competencies of the student, I was actually thinking of something I was reading in these days about COVID and how actually we are living what a medical anthropologist, Meryl Singer, some of you may know him, is calling a syndemic rather than a pandemic, right? Which puts together two words, synergy and epidemic, which occurs when you have two or more diseases that interact in such a way that it causes greater harm than the sum of their parts. And I think we all recognize that we are facing not only a disease, which has really dire consequences, but also a social disease, which is expressed in huge inequality that we've seen, rising inequality, rising poverty, lack of access to basic services, and as well as major social emotional problems, of course. And this also implies strategies to address this that are multidisciplinary in nature, where education plays a fundamental role. So in response to the rising importance and relevance of social emotional skills, and this is the focus of our conversation today, over the last decades, we have seen actually an increased incorporation of social and emotional learning in education. And this, of course, also has raised important question about how not only we can provide key feedback about individual and social learning to students and teachers, but also how we can assess the climate in the classroom and the climate in the whole school system as very important determinants of social and emotional learning. So we know that recognizing that social emotional learning is not just an outcome to be achieved, but is a process in which to engage. This, of course, raises questions for how social emotional learning assessment can be applied across various aspects of the process and across different contexts and different scales. And also, if social emotional learning assessment is to be equitable, it also needs to recognize the intersections of culture, the intersection of gender in itself, and it also has to provide inroad for learners which have diverse needs and expectations. So the objective of our session today is really to draw on what we have in terms of research, current policy and policy development and practices, and to examine what are possibilities. We'll listen our speaker, what are gaps towards a future vision actually for assessing social and emotional learning. So again, as I said, we'll take SEL as a process rather than an outcome. And we'll look at, we'll receive insight on how assessment works at the system level. And therefore, there will be consideration for policymakers, for experts when it comes to assessment across the system, but also at the level of learner, right? With consideration more for school administrators and for teachers. We have three distinguished panelists with us that I'm going to introduce. I'm very pleased to introduce it to you. We have Dr. Valerie Shapiro. Valerie is an associate professor, jointly appointed in social welfare and public health at the University of California in Berkeley. She has been studying the promotion of well-being of children and youth through the implementation and the continuous improvement of effective prevention practices, such as systematic and transformative social and emotional learning in school. Valerie is a very renowned author and a co-author of the DESSA, which is a tool for measuring social and emotional competences in children and in youth throughout the United States, where she resides. She is also a member of the California Department of Education State Cell Advisor Group, and we had the pleasure of having Valerie with us to co-author actually a UNESCO guidance, which is in the making, on the mainstreaming of cell into education system. And of course, she's looking at the assessment, monitoring, and evaluation side. Hi, Valerie. We have also with us Nandini Chatterjee Singh. Nandini is a cognitive neuroscientist, and she is currently a senior project officer at the UNESCO Institute, the Mahatma Gandhi Institute on Education for Peace and Sustainable Development, based in New Delhi in India, where she is leading the Rethinking Learning program, which is focused on cultivating social and emotional skills for peace and for global citizenship in children from K to 12. And Nandini, Nandini has developed what we call EMC2, which is a neuroscience-based framework that builds cell competencies of empathy, the E, the mindfulness, compassion, and critical inquiry. And she is focused on designing and developing curricula using digital pedagogy, innovative digital pedagogy. She will talk to us about that. So to cultivate cell and she conducts research to assess their efficacy in school education system. And last but not least, we have Pablo Pincheira, who from Chile, who is the director of an organization that is called Forgia Chile. And this is an organization that has more than 12 years of experience in promoting social and emotional development. Pablo is also a member of a commission of the Education Ministry of Chile that look at school coexistence, so living together. He's a psychology professor in philosophy in Chile, and is specialized in mental health, and is currently also a candidate for a PhD in social sciences and youth. He has an extensive experience in intervention for cultural change in educational context. So welcome our three panelists. We will start with the presentation, and each panelist, I recall, will have a dedicated time of 15 minutes. All the participants in the session can raise questions or comments through the chat function, and we'll take, after all the three presentations, we'll take questions from the audience for a little bit of time. I just would like to recall that we have interpretation that is available in French, English, Spanish, and Korean. And I think we can start. So I would like to start with Valerie. And Valerie, she will, let's say, share her reflection with us on how can an assessment system be designed to support social-emotional learning delivery across the entire cell process, and we would say also across the entire education system. Valerie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for inviting me here today to think with you about the future of SEL assessment. I'm here from the United States representing a team, including Cindy Mells from Uruguay and Young Lee from South Korea, who have been thinking about the way in which we can design an assessment system that will help to mainstream SEL worldwide with a team at UNESCO. So we'll be talking about that work today. Next slide, please. So to make sure we're all talking about the same concept here that we're trying to assess and measure, evaluate of social emotional learning, I just put forth this definition for you that was published in the American Psychologist. That's a common current understanding of SEL in the United States that's been promoted by Castle and also been received more broadly Social emotional learning involves a coordinated set of evidence-based programs and practices to establish safe and supportive learning environments and to foster social and emotional competencies, including the abilities to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show caring and concern for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. And as we see that definition, we can think about how this is related to the sustainable goals that we have for our work to transform education. But what I also point out here is that such a large, next slide please, that such a large portion of this definition, oops, sorry, back one, is about the child level competency. So if you look at how I've bracketed aspects of this definition here, we have one line that's about the delivery system, what we're doing in schools. We have one line about the supportive environments, and then we have several lines about the outcomes that we want to achieve. And I fully believe that students and individuals should be at the center of social emotional learning, that we should keep our objective clearly in mind. But also we need to think about how we get there and how assessment can help us not just see if we've gotten there or how near or far we are to the goal, but also our approach to promoting positive youth development worldwide. Next slide, please. So the guidance document that we're working on as drafted reminds us that SEL is not an outcome to achieve, but a process in which to engage. And given that, it would also be true that SEL assessment is not just a judgment to be made, but a process for collecting information as the basis for decision making for the purpose of continuously improving SEL delivery systems. And I just want to sit here for a moment because this is a little bit of a departure from the history of SEL assessment that has really focused as the definition on student level outcomes. And without taking anything away from the importance of that, we just want to consider how to broaden that to actually provide us information for decision making across various levels, whether it be national or regional or at a school site, in order to improve SEL. Next slide, please. So here are some of the principles. These are not new principles, but this is the way we've synthesized and organized them. And I actually will start with the middle principle that's midway through your screen, comprehensive. And this builds off the point I just made, that we want to make sure our assessment systems use a variety of approaches to achieve a variety of purposes across all levels of the system. So we're thinking about a delivery system. We do need to think about national policy, and we need to go all the way down to curriculum and pedagogy and classroom practices. And if we are thinking about what information we need at all of those different levels, then we go back up to say, well, we want it to be balanced. We don't want our assessment system to overrepresent one purpose or decision maker, but to consider the teacher as a decision maker, the educator, as well as the policymaker that might be leading the national agenda. And up further on this screen, we want the system to be aligned. If it's going to be effective and sustainable, it needs to be synergistic with curriculum and pedagogy and well integrated, not an add-on, but something that's well integrated and a part of educational practice. And then heading down to the principles at the bottom of your screen, we want this to be defensible, because if we're going to be making important decisions that affect the lives of young people and future generations, we really need to make sure that the information we collect is worthy of those decisions, that it's trustworthy information, and that it doesn't just help sustain an existing narrative, but it's actually information that's needed for the purpose of making decisions, and that will justify the costs of collecting this information. And finally, last but not at all least, it's important that this assessment system be based on the principles of morality and equity. It's inclusive, it's fair, it's transparent. And in systems like these, we need to give the greatest consideration for the least powerful members of our society. Next slide, please. So where do we begin? And I argue here that we begin with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 4.7 that you're all familiar with. And this is to ensure that we have inclusive and equitable quality education. And this includes human rights and gender equity and the promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and an appreciation of cultural diversity and the contributions of culture. Next slide. So if we begin there, we need to think about how to use assessment to actually pull those lofty, ambitious, beautiful goals into a national context. And this is where each context will have to choose an SEL framework that makes sense in their context, that is conceptually clear, ecologically grounded in that context, and buttressed by empirical evidence. So here you have an image of the Castle Wheel, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, which is quite a popular model, but it's not the only model. And what's really important here is that we choose a framework that meets these criteria in order to inform all the assessment that comes after it. Next slide. Then we propose that it is very important to assemble a design team. This design team is intended to include the perspectives of stakeholder and rights holder groups, such that you understand the decision makers and the decisions they're making in the decision context that they're making it, such that the information that you gather will be relevant and usable and inclusive of all these different perspectives. And so the design team has really two purposes. One is to build support for an SEL assessment system, because as we've discussed that there is such a need for social emotional learning worldwide, and this is becoming embraced to a level that we might have not imagined several years ago. It's not quite, it doesn't have quite the same level of support for the assessment system. And we need to make sure that people understand why we'd be collecting the data we're collecting and the value that it has, and the safety protocols in place to make sure that it's done in an ethical and defensible way. So we need to have a team that's actually focused on thinking about that. And also a team that's thinking about how to take that SEL framework that's been selected and translating it into a framework for systemic inquiry, which is your assessment system. So the question of this design team becomes, what information is needed for what purpose? And I might add, what information is needed for what purposes? Make that plural, because there are so many purposes. There's so much information we need when we're actually trying to transform education in this way. Next slide, please. So once you've found your purpose, which won't happen as quickly as I just described it, we need to think about different functions that different informations have. And it is very common to talk about 3 different types of information: for needs assessment, for process evaluation, for outcome evaluation. And the needs assessment is really thinking about what is the problem and getting many perspectives on it, and perhaps doing focus groups with young people about their vision for a culture of peace, and perhaps understanding what solutions would be acceptable to parents and families in the local context. And the local contexts might also be plural, and we might need to do many multifaceted needs assessments to understand the diverse populations that we serve. The process evaluation is really about adherence to a shared vision, to think about, are we actually delivering SEL the way we're intending based on our framework? And outcome is to see if we're achieving the intended impacts for all. We've focused for a long time in SEL assessment on summative assessment, the criterion as to whether we're doing what we said we were going to do, or what we want to do, or how far away we are. But we argue that assessment has a really important role formatively for providing actionable feedback to inform real-time decisions and adjustments. And so that's the kind of information we need this system to provide for us. Next slide. So we suggest that once you have your purpose, you need to think about your techniques for data collection. And this is way broader than a specific tool. This is thinking about in what ways can you use existing protocols, either from your local context or imported from another context, learn about them, assess them for fit, adapt them, but not necessarily start from scratch. The second is a process of standardization, which just means keeping some elements consistent so that you can compare differences between student subgroups or differences across regions and contexts, or look at change over time. So there's a real value for keeping some of these protocols consistent, but also a real value for customizing some aspects that you really need something that's deeply contextual. So there's a balance to be held here. We also talk about prefabricated approaches and really thinking about how easy it can be to distribute a survey and to aggregate that information relative to conducting really deep level analysis conversations with people, but how these also serve different purposes, and the efficiency of doing a prefabricated approach and aggregating that information may presume that there isn't a lot of work that goes into ensuring fit of that survey and ensuring that the information is defensible in the local context. So all of the work has to be done up front in those cases so that you can aggregate efficiently. Whereas other approaches, we don't need to anticipate that we know everything in advance and we can let those insights emerge. And here again, we're suggesting a hybrid approach for different purposes, which is why this all needs to be grounded in purpose. Sampling. Many of you know that we'll need to think about whether you need a census sample, a representative sample, a stratified sample, if you need to really amplify marginalized voices in the information you seek, or if you need to select for specific purposes. And this doesn't necessarily just mean on the child level. We could think about how we need to listen to policymakers, our legislative, our politicians. Maybe we need to look at a hearing, but we don't need to look at all hearings. We need to look at a specific one for a specific purpose, and that might give us information we need. And the periodicity, we need to think about if we're looking at a moment in time or if we're looking across time, either following the same individuals or following people in the same role. So maybe a cohort of sixth graders, 11-year-olds, or maybe heads of school and how their attitudes or skills have changed over time. Next slide, please. So then you get to the point of selecting your tools, and we argue that sometimes people jump right to the tools, and we need to back up and do all of that pre-work to make sure the tools are giving you the information you need for the purposes you have. But we do also comment, and pictured here on the slide is the Devereux student strengths assessment, the DESA, which comes up in all of these registries. Registries have become important for helping people select different tools. Think about which are available digitally and what language they're available in and how long they take, and sometimes what frameworks they map onto, and the cost, all sorts of decisions that are really pragmatic and important. But ultimately, these need to be driven by the purpose that you have. So we suggest there's a tremendous value for registries to help users make decisions, but also right now, they are insufficient in that they tilt towards these prefabricated approaches. They are highly focused on student level and climate level outcomes. And there's not as many where you can say, well, are we implementing this policy on a national level? Most of those are not included in this registry. It also it might say that a tool is reliable or valid, but it's out of the context of a given purpose. So we don't know if it's reliable or valid for the purpose that you want to use it for. And so there needs to be some real thoughtfulness there before adopting an assessment tool. And these registries right now really do favor Western frameworks and use contexts, and that we really need to leverage the regional learning networks that we have available to contribute to these registries, broaden them, and think about how together we can create a library of learning so that when we design or select or try a tool for a specific purpose, we are sharing that broadly with each other, and so that they can be adapted for different purposes and different uses in different regions. Next slide, please. So we go down this path, and what I will leave you with today is just moving from that framework in your top corner, moving to the design team, moving to the purpose, moving to all of these complex decisions about the techniques you'll use, and then the tools. And finally, if you advance the slide one more time. Next slide, please. we want to really think about how to prepare it for use and not as an afterthought. We want to think about how we will share assessment information with folks and how we will actually use it to improve the system. And this needs to not be an afterthought, but part of the design team right in the beginning. Because we don't have a use for it and it's not easy to use for its decision by its decision makers, then we have a lot of waste, and we're trying to have sustainable development, not waste. With that, I've prepared some questions that I think will be interesting to ask on the next slide, but I'll leave those for the discussion session for us to think about together. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Valerie, for a very comprehensive and clear presentation. I think that it's clear from your reflection on the importance of cell more as a process, right, in your consideration, and really the importance to utilize this collection of information to really improve cell at the system level. And I like these, some of these key concepts that you use when it comes to having a shared vision, which is very important, to have this design team and they can really co-design and co-create this framework needed and contextualize it as well when you mention the need to really bring it down to meet the needs of the country. Now, you also mentioned that for a long time, there was a lot of focus on summative assessment when it comes to cell, while now there is much more and more. Our attention is drawn on formative assessment. And now we are moving to Nandini. So Nandini, when it comes to formative assessment, how can different forms of formative assessment support social emotional learning for learners? Please, Nandini.
Thank you so much, Cecilia and Apsio, for this wonderful opportunity. And it's a delight to be with such eminent speakers at this panel. So Valerie set the stage really well on what SEL assessment should focus on and what we know about it. And we must admit at the outset that there are a lot of challenges. This is a growing field, and we are just starting out on this very, very fascinating journey. So what I'm going to try and do over the next few minutes is to share with you some ideas that are emerging on how SEL might be assessed, and share some insights that we have had from a little bit of research that we have dared to do in this direction. Being very explicit at the outset that these are all new adventures in the field, but we are recognizing that we are learning from them, and we have learned a lot also from the pandemic right now as it's happened on how these assessments might therefore have to be designed more carefully. So I come from the Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development in New Delhi, and our mandate really is to mainstream social and emotional learning in education systems. So with that setting, you will also probably recognize why we are interested not just in developing evidence-based content and curricula, but also engaging in a very important part of this entire ecosystem, which is assessment. And I think globally, we are rather well poised now to re-examine what assessment is for and what is the purpose of it. So I'm hoping to touch upon that a little bit too today. So could we go to the next slide, please? So Valerie already laid out, but just for the sake of completeness, I want to bring to fore again the kinds of competencies we are trying to assess. Okay, we are wanting to look at emotions, how children and adults understand, manage, and process them. How does goal setting happen? How do we recognize and express empathy for others, and also build positive relationships? Now, any of us who's lived any bit of life knows that recognizing and processing emotions and having measurements for them is easier said than done. Okay, we struggle with it in our daily lives, trying to figure out whether a colleague at the other end of the table is happy with what you said or not. And now in this digital world, it's become an even more challenge because many of us have been interacting primarily digitally. And therefore, our engagement as we proceed in a conversation depends so much on trying to understand how our social interactions and our emotions are being processed. So somewhere along the line, we also recognize the challenge of what we are trying to assess. Okay? And that makes social and emotional learning a bigger challenge. Okay? Next slide, please. Valerie already talked about this, but one of the things that we recognize, which is very crucial for any competency that one is trying to cultivate, is not just a good pedagogical approach, but clear, measurable assessments that can be replicated time and again, and which are set to be able to improve children. So I want to try and say that we probably need to change the conversation on assessment instead of being of learning as assessment for learning. Okay. So how do I make sure where I stand so that I can continue to improve rather than just worrying about a gold standard or a goal that might have been set? Because increasingly we realize that and it is important for us to keep improving. And that's probably something that needs to become the basis of all assessment, not just SEL assessment, but even more so in the case of SEL assessment. Okay? And therefore, it's probably pertinent here to talk about a Kaizen culture, which is normally used in organizations to improve them. But in this case, I'm referring to it as a methodology that pushes forth continuous improvement. Okay, so we need to be able to find ways to identify and pick up small positive changes that are happening, which are leading towards a larger goal, but in an attempt or design systems in a way that those small changes can be measured and identified so that growth is something that a child and or an adult can continuously see. Okay, that feature of seeing growth at small increments is so important to be able to achieve or work towards a competency. And that's something I think is crucial to SEL assessment in particular, and fits in very well with the formative approach that Valerie talked about earlier. And therefore, the need and emphasis on continuous assessment of SEL. Okay, we cannot just have them as one-time assessments, but connect this again to the goals that we want to achieve. So set little goals and find little ways to monitor and manage and measure those goals, and that is a much better way to build SEL competencies along the way. Okay. Next slide, please. So having set that stage, I want to try and talk about some various formats of assessment that exist and some that are now emerging. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay. So one of the most popularly used formats of assessment, and this is something that we have used extensively at MGIB2, are self-reports. Okay. I apologize that the font size on the slide is a little small, so you might have a challenge reading it. But the important things about self-reports are that they are very easy to obtain and implement, and they can be anonymized. Okay. The challenges are, and for me, this is the biggest challenge of self-reports, is the difference between stated versus revealed preferences. Okay, this is a term I learned from our director, Ananta, who's an economist, and this is a concept that is used extensively in economics also. So you believe or you think that this is a competency that you should have. Remember, Valerie talked on her last slide of social desirability. Okay, so we all have need to be socially desirable. Okay, but stating that you have these abilities versus actually possessing them. So the stated versus the revealed is something that self-reports are not able to capture. Okay? Time and again, and children, mind you, are very smart. They know what is expected behavior of them. Whether they want to practice that behavior is a secondary matter. Okay? So we therefore have to find ways to get around this challenge of self versus stated preferences. Over the years, what we have come to recognize is teachers already have a lot on their plate, and adding one more assessment, which they need to fill out in more detail, adds to some of those challenges. And sometimes it's a bit of a challenge to find assessments that cater to all the different domains of a particular competency that you're trying to build. Okay, so you don't want to end up having children or adults fill in 65 questions, because there's just going to be assessment fatigue that will set in after some point in time. So whilst these have been extremely popular, we have been using these, it really is time to move on to other formats. And this is where we think that the assessment world is now getting a little exciting and probably poised to try out a few new things. Next slide, please. Okay, so a new emerging feature of assessments, which interestingly can be used both in on pen and paper as well as in digital formats, is scenario-based analysis. Okay, and that helps you to some extent work with the challenge of stated versus revealed preferences, or it can allow you to get into a little more detail. Okay, so the idea here is that you provide participants with scenarios. Okay, and based on those scenarios, that is, you describe an incident and then say that now, if this is the scenario presented to you, you give it to a teacher who's done an SEL course and say, if this is what's happening in your classroom, which of the 4 or 5 choices would you make? Okay, and that tells you a little bit about how the teacher is thinking about a particular situation, and can provide interesting insights to support what you might have gotten from self-reports. These have proved to be quite interesting, and people are using them quite effectively in classrooms and in courses. And some of our courses that we've designed on Framerspace actually do include some scenario-based assessments. For lack of time, I won't show you any of these, but this is something that is certainly worth exploring. And one of the best parts about scenario-based assignment analysis is designing the scenarios. If you sit together as a group and come up with scenarios, your real-life experiences can really feed into these, and that becomes an extremely exciting process. Next slide, please. There's a little bit of a delay, I think, between the slide and the turn.
So we can see the next already.
Oh, sorry, I can't see it yet. I can't see it yet, which is why. So just let me know, Cecilia, next time. So yes. Then the next thing that I want to move on to, and this is something that has been something we started out to do at MGIP, but over the last year or two has picked up some momentum, has been digital performance-based frameworks. Okay, one thing that I think COVID has established for us is that blended learning is here to stay. Okay, and we think technology today is uniquely poised to actually work with pedagogy to provide an extremely engaging and new way to try and think of assessments, which can actually be very inclusive, multimodal, and engaging all at the same time. In fact, we've designed, we think digital-based frameworks now allow you to do performance-based assessments. And that really is going to be key. If you can find assessments where you can look at the performance of the child, of the adult, as they are going through or learning different skills. The way this design can work is it allows the person to be motivated. It allows you to create an immersive experience. And remember, we are building these competencies in order to drive behavioral change. Okay? So it's great if we are able to create scenarios where we can create immersive experiences. Next slide, please. So I'm going to try and talk about a few of my favorite ones with specific examples. Interestingly, my slide is still not moved. Now it's moved finally. I'm going to talk about a very interesting assessment, which is based on the flanker task. Okay, so because of my interest in cognitive neuroscience and cognitive science, one of the things that we know is you want to try and develop cognitive flexibility in individuals so that they can understand different points of view. You also want to enable children and adults to have the ability or to acquire the ability to suppress an inappropriate response. Okay. And this can be studied very interestingly using the flanker task. Okay. This has been something that's been around in cognitive science for years. Okay. So if you look at the slide carefully on your right, and if I showed you the first, if you looked at the image on the extreme right at the bottom, you can see arrows pointing one way. And if I asked you, is this congruent? Then you can say, yes, it's congruent because all the arrows are pointing in a particular way. In the next one, if I showed you one, it would be some are pointing one way and some are pointing the other way. And in that case, it would be, it's an incongruent task. Okay. Now, in an ability to quickly answer, you often jump and you make mistakes. So you therefore have to reflect before you make the decision. And some points in time when you are in an emotionally charged mood, okay, you might actually make incorrect assessments. So you can test this when people are in neutral states, and you can test the same thing when people are in emotional states. And you see how their ability to inhibit an incorrect response changes. So this has been proved to be an extremely useful task and can be designed very easily in a classroom. In fact, now there are mobile-based assessments which use the flanker task. Let's move to the next slide. I think I'm running a little out of time.
Yes, if you can start, yes, you will just have a couple of minutes left, if you can try.
Yes. Then there's one on emotional perspective taking, but this is again a very similar task where you're provided an emotional situation, but the two people are masked and you have to make a choice about what their expressions might be like if they were listening to like this. But let me move quickly, just to give you a minute on what games can do in such a scenario. So next slide, please. And if you could play the video. We find that if you could play the video, please, that would be great. So game-based assessments are emerging in extremely attractive ways.
So where do you think we're supposed to sit? I think I'll go see if I can sit with those kids I had class with earlier. Okay, so I guess I'll just have to go sit by myself, since there's only one seat open there. Hey, didn't I see you over with another kid? Did you just ditch them to come over here? Yeah, I wanted to hang out with you guys. We all met earlier in the day, remember?
Yeah, but it's not cool to ditch your friends. You should go over there and apologize.
I'm sorry for leaving you to go and talk with those other kids. I was just really excited. Are we okay?
So on that note, I'm running short of time, but I hope I've made a case that there are interesting formats for assessing SEL skills, and you should really try out a number of them before you decide what works best for your classroom. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Nandini, for all this interesting presentation. I think this will also be shared. So I'm sure all the participants who are following us will have the opportunity to go through the whole presentation. But thanks for that. Thanks for also pointing out how we are really working on assessment for learning, right? And this is what we are looking at now instead of assessment of learning. And what you know, I think it was interesting to see how this tool you're talking, you mentioned the self-report as a form of formative assessment, explaining what are the strengths but also the challenges, right, when it comes to that. So thanks for sharing the work you're doing on gaming, which is very interesting. And this actually will bring us also to our next panelist, who is Pablo. So we have looked at assessment from a system level, then we zoomed into a formative assessment, forms of formative assessment. And now Pablo is going to share his experience and reflection on how can a layered approach to social and emotional learning assessment address both the individual and the social element of self, right? And how can these assessments support both the student learning but also teacher learning? So Pablo, we are all listening to you.
Muchas gracias, Cecilia, por esta introducción, y también a Chapiro y Dani, porque nos estaban mostrando
Yes.
cómo se favorece.
Thank you very much for the introduction. The previous speakers talked about evidence-based data and the importance of such data, and talked about the different game-based approaches that we can take. So now I would like to talk about what we are doing in Chile. And I would like to talk about the experience in training socio-emotional skills, particularly on high school students. So that's, well, what we did in the past, but now we also look at not only students, but also teachers and the administration staff. So I would like to talk about my experience. So we want to make sure that all the students can change their environment. And when we base this on the environment and experience, I believe that we can achieve this goal. So we make sure that the teachers, when they engage in such activities with their peers and the students, then they will be able to learn from one another. And I believe that we can then apply that to the society level. And based on this, we want to bring transformation in society. So for example, let's say empathy or leadership are some of the skills that we focus on, and also communication skills. And these are some of the areas that we look at. At the same time, based on specific context or situation, we situate all the different elements. And recently, based on cultural context, we actually diagnosed the situation, and that was our preliminary assessment of students and teachers. And they exchanged ideas on what their thoughts on social and emotional skills, and that really was key to changing the culture and bringing transformation to our culture. At the same time, in Chile, we wanted to enhance social and emotional skills, which are soft capability. And we use different terminology to refer to social and emotional skills. And we not only look at SES at the personal level, but communication skills at different levels. And we wanted to visualize and make the result tangible. We have to first know ourselves as individuals to be able to connect better with other persons and the society. So we built a simple model which has three pillars. First, it's a self capacity. The second one is relationship skills. And number three is community level skills together with the environment. So we designed this cycle and incorporated learning to boost different skills. And John Diego and other authors also endorse this model. And I believe that this model is quite significant in terms of pedagogy. And for instance, sports can be used and other methodologies can also be used. And for instance, empathy and self-awareness and sense of cooperation were some of the elements that we came up with and asked the teachers to assess these elements. But here, at the last assessment, the scores were lower, which actually drew our attention because at first, when we kicked off a project, students were quite shy to express their emotions. But individual and systematic assessment were of course different. But I believe that how to evaluate each element effectively was quite important. So we looked at efficiency, effectiveness, as well as satisfaction. And these were some of the dimensions that we looked at. And then how will teachers be able to assess themselves, and how will we assess the entire process? And then we also decided to look at 5 different dimensions, including self-awareness and empathy, which is about personal awareness and personal empathy. Of course, my emotions may be different from others. However, we still can understand one another. So it was about the different types of social relationships we can have with others. And the third one was assertiveness. Number 4 was collaboration. Number 5 was determination. And by using this model, we looked at the different personal experiences and individual experiences of the students, and we wanted to translate that into a community level action so that people can have a sense of belonging to the community and share that sense of oneness with one another. And as you can see from the photos on the next slide, we did not just examine the personal competencies, but it's also important to look at the weaknesses, because we not only look it's not only important to look at the bright side, but also the dark side, to have a cool-headed view of yourself. So you have to understand yourself better. Now moving on to the next slide. And based on this experience, we were able to learn one lesson. So of course, creating a great environment is good, but sometimes we also need to create a stressed environment so that people value inclusivity and we can lead to it tangible results. So the first one was unconditional acceptance. The second one was active listening. So it was about listening to one another and focusing on the message. And number three was empathy. And we had this outdoor activity, and different games and tasks were used. And participants gave one another feedback, and then they moved on to the next step, which led to a circular outcome. So we focus on emotional, behavioral, and cognitive elements. And this helped us very much. Next slide. So 150 institutions that we worked with were secondary and tertiary secondary schools. But then when it comes to relationship, is key for middle school students and high school students. And we need to teach these skills to the students so that they can become a better member of the society, which is why we also mapped the different cognitive skills and the thinking of the students. So we conducted workshops and students assessed their performance, and this was a new experience for the students. And you can see on the next slide that they were able to learn and grow from this. We intervened and assessed their cognitive, affectional, and behavior. And we also focused on feedback. So feedback was given. Let's say, for instance, when students behave certain ways, we gave them feedback like this. So based on these and these and these, you were able to achieve this much, and this was your performance. And if you go to the next slide, so they wanted to focus on local actions, but it was not easy to induce behavioral change at the individual level. So we encouraged schools, individual schools, to provide programs that fit their own needs, because we cannot customize all the programs. And also, as you can see here, students were able to communicate with their peers and parents, and it was an opportunity for the students to embed 4.7 SDG target to their everyday life. So these were some of the activities that we conducted, and that's what the students did. They engaged in joint activities. We provided feedback and workshop to the students. And we also gave them support for social and emotional skills. And amidst the pandemic, there were many challenges, but we provided the programs to help students overcome the pandemic. So we understand when we have to understand that human can unleash their potential within a community. We have to acknowledge opportunities and we have to visualize the advances that we have made so far. And we have to take a macro when viewing this. Now we have to have regular workshops and meetings, and I believe that this is a possibility across Chile. Now, local regions have their own specific surroundings and circumstances, and of course, we will need to closely work with the local government as well as the local schools so that they provide customized and localized workshops. And we also had some programs where students visited senior citizens' houses to provide assistance. And now moving on to the next slide. Now, we have to identify beauty where others only see the routine view. So this is my message. We have to have a strong sense of community. We have to promote self-awareness, and we have to know that self-experience is also key. Also, the pandemic inflicted much suffering, but we have to understand that everyone suffers from the pandemic. So I would like to once again say that social and emotional skills are key to education. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pablo, for bringing us down to Chile and to see this interesting experience that you have developed actually through the years of your work with the foundation. I think this idea of looking at these three dimensions, the model that you presented, the intrapersonal, interpersonal, and the social level. And really, I think you made us touch with hands also what does it mean to translate certain type of competencies into at the community level, right? Around your society. And I think it really brings to life our target when we talk about 4.7, what does it really mean to bring this to our daily life? And this idea of creating spaces for a development that becomes collaborative. So it's very interesting. Now we have about 10 minutes left, and perhaps just to conclude this round of conversation, we can have just a few questions for each of you. I think you had addressed a different level, if you want, when it comes to assessment, all linked to each other, right? I think it was an interesting zooming in. And perhaps one question, if I can go back to Valerie and start with her. One interesting point after having listened to Nandini also, and now to Pablo, how do you think the education system really engage or can engage community in their in their assessment strategy that they can design?
Thank you, and thank you for such wonderful talks and insights today. I really think that engaging community is essential for contextualizing assessment in a given environment and to make sure there's a good cultural fit. And will that will translate to whether it measures what it's intended to measure and also whether the decisions are valid. for their use, but also the extent to which one might experience support or resistance in the community. And so I think it's really important from the moment of needs assessment all the way through thinking about the intended uses and the communication strategy that many diverse community stakeholders need to be involved and across many different sectors. Sometimes we think that education needs to bear this alone, but I think we do really well when we partner with other sectors in our community. We go down to early learning, we go up to higher education, and we think about, the whole cradle to career, and all the other folks that want to support social emotional learning, including the employment sector, including the health sector, and how we can collaborate. But essentially, I think we need to think about how to reach out to parents, families, and young people themselves to elevate their voice, to inform the vision, the framework, all the way down to the decisions that we're making.
Well, thank you very much, Valerie. Nandini, there is one question for you, which has to do with the teachers, and based on your experience, how teachers create digital assessments that are integrative with their classes. As we know, social emotional learning may be integrated within different subjects, right? And with other subject learning. Would it be possible? Did you experience that? Did you see that?
Absolutely, Cecilia. In fact, over the last year and a half, as we've implemented SEL courses online, one of the things that we have also included for teachers is a course on digital pedagogies, okay? And that has empowered them to use technology for pedagogy and assessment, okay? And so as we've done these trainings with teachers, so the important point that these courses have tried to do is first build the SEL skills of teachers and SEL for teachers, then build how do you take these skills to the classrooms and SEL for classrooms. Now, if you're doing all of this virtually, how do you enable effective pedagogy, and how do you allow assessment to happen? And the digital pedagogy course introduces you to ideas like Padlet, Genially, then even using building scenario-based assessments, which we find teachers are actually able to do very effectively with very interesting input coming in from students themselves. So students build some of the graphics which can be used by the teacher, and they've been doing interesting emotion-based perspective taking in the classroom. Okay. So we are at a point today where some of this can actually be integrated and start out a whole new, I almost think of it as a new era of assessments where they are participative and students can see themselves growing, that, last week, this is how I rated this, and now a week later, this is how I think differently about it because we've discussed it in the classroom. So that teacher-student engagement is turning out to be a very fruitful dialogue. So these are absolutely possible, and I'm happy to provide more information should somebody want to write in.
Thank you very much, Nandini. And actually, since we mentioned actually the work done also with teachers when it comes to this assessment, that also has a bearing on them, right? That brings us to our last question, because I think we are running almost out of time. And I would like to go back to Pablo after he presented this contextual assessment that his experience, and the assessment that they're doing with students at the same time also with the teachers. So Pablo, assessing the teachers in the same way as you assess students might give teachers a greater insight into how their students are doing and are processing social and emotional learning. So in your experiences, have you heard from teachers how this harmony of assessments supported themselves, the teachers, to adapt their self-teaching or think of their work in new ways and in different ways? And also, perhaps if you found teachers that were resistant to being assessed as well.
Muchas gracias por la pregunta. Y sí, lo primero es que surge
Thank you very much for that question. Yes, we do have resistance from the people, and it's very difficult to expect receptive behaviors. So assessing impact of all the different elements is not easy, but of course assessment and the same method is also applied to the teachers, but of course the elements and the dimensions are the same. However, the workshops and the processes are different from students to teachers. Of course, our perspective is important, but workshops provide an opportunity for the teachers to reflect on their behaviors on themselves. And at first, they did not like the idea of being assessed, but after they understood that this was not to evaluate them and score them, we were able to build trust with the teachers, and now they have become more engaging and more acceptive. And when we provide different activities in classrooms, we saw teachers really exploring new approaches and ideas, and they were more enthusiastic about such approaches. So it was a great experience overall.
Thank you very much. I would like to really thank again our excellent speakers today. I think we had a lot of food for thought. I think we had a very, how can I say, motivating conversation when it comes to the assessment of social emotional learning. I think we have seen actually from the overall framework down to the real implementation, what does it really mean, right, to assess for learning, and what transformation also in the learners can be. I think that we all acknowledge that social emotional learning is as important as learning how to speak, how to write, right? Any other cognitive knowledge. At the end, emotions are influence everything that we do. So and I think not only in this time, but particularly in this time, students and learners really have to learn how to be and to feel well. So I think we had very excellent example and ideas, and I would actually invite all of you to also follow our speaker in their work. We will share the presentation, and we can also share some of their latest research, by the way, and reports. So thank you very much once again, and thanks to all the participants to follow this session. Bye.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias.